The hum of the afternoon was steady, a soft blend of cicadas in the trees and the distant hum of lawnmowers in backyards. Nothing about the moment felt urgent or wrong, until it did. The sudden sound of tires crunching over gravel pierced the stillness on Maple Avenue, followed by the low rumble of a patrol cruiser easing to a stop in front of Evelyn Brooks' home. The car, black and white and freshly polished, stood out like a sore thumb in the sleepy neighborhood, a symbol of authority that had no business being there that day. Inside the vehicle were two deputies, Officer Greg Dalton and Deputy James Miller. Greg was the senior of the two, a man hardened by years on the job, the kind whose body language walked ahead of his voice, tense, assertive, never far from confrontation. James, younger and clearly still learning how to carry the weight of his badge, looked uncertain before the door even opened. Still, they stepped out, boots heavy on the pavement, hands already hovering closer to their belts than necessary. From her porch, Evelyn noticed the car right away, but didn't move. She didn't have any reason to. She was just sitting, like she always did. She assumed maybe they were responding to something further down the street. But when they started walking directly toward her porch, she felt that quiet shift in the air. That subtle, familiar tension that had followed her in different forms over the years. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She just waited. The officers approached with a kind of cautious authority, the kind used not when a crime has been committed, but when someone's mind is already halfway to deciding that one has. James spoke first, politely but stiff, asking what she was doing outside. Evelyn answered clearly. She'd been sitting there all afternoon, drinking tea. That was it. That had been her entire day. But her answer didn't seem to satisfy them. Greg took over quickly, his tone more pointed. His questions weren't about understanding. They were about control. Where had she been earlier? Why was she outside? Was she alone? His eyes scanned her porch like he was expecting to find something out of place. But there was only a teacup, a small table, a folded newspaper, and the quiet presence of a woman who had lived on that street longer than most of the houses had stood. Even as Evelyn responded with clarity and calm, the feeling of suspicion didn't fade. If anything, it grew. Every word she said seemed to be heard through a filter of doubt. Every pause, every breath was treated like a gap that needed to be filled with assumptions. And all the while, Greg's stance grew firmer. He took a step onto the first wooden porch step, his boots heavy against the worn wood, his hand brushing the edge of his holster, not drawing, but close enough to be seen. Close enough to make a statement. James shifted awkwardly behind him. His eyes darted from Evelyn's face to the porch and back again. Something about the whole scene didn't sit right with him. It was too still, too ordinary. There was no threat, no reason to escalate. But he said nothing. Because Greg was leading, and he followed. Evelyn stayed seated, her hands on the arms of her chair. She didn't move, didn't raise her voice. She simply responded, again and again, to questions that didn't deserve answers in the first place. She was calm, but beneath that calm was a quiet ache, the kind that came from knowing that no matter how many years she'd lived in peace, it only took one call, one assumption, to erase all of it in an instant. The porch, which had once been her sanctuary, now felt like a stage. Every movement, every word, every breath was being watched, interpreted, judged. She wasn't a person anymore in that moment. She was a problem to solve, a file to close, a call to check off the list. And all she had done was sit in her chair, in her home, on her street. What neither officer realized as they stood there pressing questions into the air was that the quiet they had walked into wasn't empty, it was layered. Layered with years of history, of memory, of quiet resistance. Evelyn wasn't confused or shaken. She had lived through worse. But she also knew something they didn't. They weren't just questioning a woman. They were questioning a legacy. And the deeper they stepped into her space, the more it became clear, this was no routine call. This was a misstep they couldn't walk back. Evelyn Brooks had spent a lifetime learning how to stay calm when the world around her didn't. She had sat through storms, both in the sky and in society. She had seen the world shift around her porch more times than she could count. So when two deputies stood in front of her, treating her like a suspect in her own neighborhood, she didn't shout. She didn't rise. She didn't rush to explain herself beyond what was fair. She just stayed exactly where she was, hands resting on the arms of her rocking chair, her teacup cooling by her side. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was choice. It was control. There was something powerful about the way she held herself. No tension in her shoulders, no panic in her voice. The air around her might have been filled with suspicion, but she refused to let it live inside her. Every breath she took was deliberate. Every answer she gave was measured. And every second she remained seated was a quiet form of defiance against everything she had seen in her 76 years. She had been here before, maybe not on this exact porch, with this exact confrontation, but she had known the feeling. The uneasiness that came with being looked at too long. The questions that weren't really questions. The shift in tone when someone realized you didn't fit their idea of who should belong. So she did what she had always done in those moments. She stood her ground without standing at all. She stayed in her chair, anchored not by stubbornness, but by dignity. Deputy Greg Dalton had moved in closer now, his stance more aggressive. His questions were no longer curious. They were confrontational. It was clear he had made up his mind, and now he was searching for a reason to make his authority known. Evelyn could see it in his eyes, in the way his fingers danced near his belt, in the tightness of his jaw. But she wouldn't give him what he was looking for. She wouldn't panic. She wouldn't rise. She wouldn't allow herself to be dragged into a narrative that had been written without her voice. James Miller, standing a few steps behind, looked increasingly uneasy. His eyes darted to the neighbor's house across the street, where a figure stood quietly behind a curtain. Another person had stepped out onto their porch, pretending to water a plant but clearly watching. The street, once silent, was beginning to stir with the kind of tension that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. Everyone could feel it, the pressure building, the sense that something was teetering on the edge of becoming too much. Still, Evelyn sat. Not because she was afraid, and not because she was trying to provoke anything. She sat because this was her home. Because this porch, this chair, this small patch of wood and sunlight had been hers for decades. It was where she found peace. Where she had raised her babies and kissed her husband good night. It was where she had cried alone and laughed with neighbors. It belonged to her, not just in paperwork, but in spirit. And she wasn't about to let anyone take that from her. Not with questions, not with threats, not with a badge. She heard the shift in Greg's voice when he warned her that non-compliance could lead to detainment. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down, as if the very air around her were holding its breath. But her body didn't flinch. Her voice didn't shake. Her refusal to move wasn't dramatic. It was calm, rooted in experience. Because she knew that sometimes the loudest message you can send doesn't come from raising your voice. It comes from refusing to shrink. In that moment, Evelyn wasn't just defending herself. She was defending every elder who had ever been questioned for existing in the wrong place. Every neighbor who had been judged by the color of their skin. Every woman who had been expected to apologize for being unbothered and unafraid. Her stillness became something more than just presence. It became protest. A quiet storm. As Greg's patience thinned and James hovered with hesitation, the scene was no longer just about a porch or a call. It was about a line being drawn. One side stood with assumptions, the other with grace. Evelyn's stillness held that line, steady and sure. And while the deputies hadn't yet realized it, they weren't in control of the moment anymore. She was. Just as the pressure on that porch reached its breaking point, a low rumble sounded from the end of the block. It wasn't loud or rushed, just steady, a smooth hum of power that seemed almost out of place in the stillness of Rosewood's sleepy streets. A black SUV turned the corner, tinted windows and clean lines catching the golden light of late afternoon. It moved with purpose, not speed, gliding up to the curb in front of Evelyn's home like it knew exactly where it was supposed to be. Evelyn didn't need to turn her head. She knew that sound, knew the timing of that engine, the feel of the air changing as it came to a stop. Her fingers relaxed around the arms of her chair, and for the first time since the deputies had approached, a quiet sense of relief passed through her. Help had arrived. Not just any help, but her son. The driver's side door opened, and Major Daniel Brooks stepped out in his crisp navy blue uniform. tall, composed, and cut from the same quiet strength as his mother. He didn't need to speak right away. His presence said everything. The curve of his back, the calm precision of his steps, the look in his eyes, it all carried the unmistakable weight of someone who understood power but never misused it. The deputies turned toward him immediately, surprised. Greg stiffened, his body automatically shifting into a more defensive posture. James took a step back, unsure of what exactly he was stepping into. They weren't expecting anyone else. They certainly weren't expecting someone like Daniel, a man who could command attention without raising his voice, a man whose badge held more authority than theirs combined. Daniel walked toward the porch, not rushing, not dragging his feet. He was scanning everything. The stance of the officers, the body language of his mother, the subtle tensions still hanging in the air. He knew this was no ordinary call. He knew, before he even opened his mouth, that something had gone wrong. And he was here not just as a son, but as a protector, as someone who had promised his mother, and himself, that she would never be left alone in moments like this. He stopped just short of the steps, close enough to take in every detail but not close enough to escalate anything. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but direct. The kind of calm that cut through chaos. He asked what was happening, not with aggression but with control. It wasn't a request, it was a call for accountability. Greg tried to maintain authority, but his confidence wavered. The name Daniel gave, the badge he showed, the title on his identification, it all shifted the ground beneath their feet. Major Daniel Brooks, State Bureau of Homeland Security. This wasn't just a relative showing up in anger. This was a ranking official asking very pointed questions with very real consequences behind them. Evelyn stayed seated, watching, letting her son take the lead. There was no need to interrupt. She had done her part, held the line, kept her ground. Now, it was his turn. And he did it with the same grace she had taught him as a boy. He didn't shout, didn't accuse, didn't lash out. He simply laid out the facts and waited for the silence to speak louder than any defense the officers might offer. Greg faltered first, trying to explain the situation in vague terms. James, clearly shaken, said little. Neither of them could offer a solid reason for what had happened, and they both knew it. Daniel stood firm, asking why a grandmother sitting on her own porch had been treated like a threat. Why a hand had hovered so close to a weapon. Why their first instinct was control instead of care. There were no good answers. Just tension, and the unmistakable shift of a power dynamic slipping away from the deputies and into the hands of someone who knew exactly what justice should look like. Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His mother's presence, her calm, her stillness, those were the things that had already changed the moment. He had simply arrived to finish what she had started. And in that moment, with the sun lowering behind the trees and the weight of everything hanging in the air, the story of that porch turned. Not because someone shouted, but because someone came. Because a son showed up, stood tall, and made it clear that no one, no matter how quiet, no matter how still, deserves to be made invisible. The moment Daniel Brooks revealed his badge, the temperature on that porch shifted. The tension that had hovered like a storm cloud suddenly got heavier, sharper, more serious. What had started as an everyday abuse of power was now something else entirely. No longer just a routine call. No longer just two officers questioning an elderly woman. This was now about accountability, about hierarchy, about consequence. Daniel didn't waste time with dramatics. He asked for their badge numbers first, not loudly, but in a tone that expected full compliance. His eyes didn't flinch. His voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. Everything about the way he stood, the way he looked at those two men, said that he had been in rooms where decisions were made. That he had the kind of voice that didn't just get heard, it got remembered. Greg Dalton hesitated, trying to collect himself, trying to explain that they were responding to a call from a concerned neighbor. But his words stumbled. Vague, defensive, and just vague enough to reveal how weak the foundation of this entire situation truly was. The logic unraveled quickly. No crime, no weapon, no real threat, and yet here they were, treating a seated elderly woman like a suspect. James Miller, younger and visibly shaken, stood back with his mouth slightly open, unsure where to stand anymore, physically or morally. He kept glancing at Evelyn, then at Daniel, then back to the cruiser. He knew something had gone wrong. He just didn't have the words or the courage to say it out loud. Daniel listened, but his face didn't change. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, disappointment, the kind that cuts deeper than yelling ever could. He repeated what the facts already made clear: no probable cause, no physical threat, no behavior suggesting danger. And still, the decision was made to escalate. Still, his mother was treated like a suspect. Still, the hand drifted toward the holster. The neighbors were watching now. Some behind drawn curtains, some standing cautiously on their porches, pretending to be focused on anything else. But everyone was watching. And phones were recording. The story was already being captured, already spreading beyond that street. That made Greg nervous. It made James anxious. But it only made Daniel more certain of what needed to happen next. He told them that a full report would be filed with the sheriff's office. He told them he wanted the body cam footage pulled that same evening. He made it clear that this wouldn't be a quiet incident filed away and forgotten. He wasn't just speaking as a son. He was speaking as an officer, one who still believed in the weight of the badge and the responsibility it carried. And he wasn't going to let them forget what that responsibility looked like. Evelyn hadn't moved. She sat still, hands on her lap, watching her son with the quiet strength of a woman who had raised him to be this kind of man. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. He was saying everything that needed to be said, not just for her, but for every person who had ever been made to feel small in their own neighborhood. Greg tried one last time to redirect the conversation, shifting the blame to the caller. But Daniel didn't let it slide. He reminded them that responding to a call doesn't mean abandoning judgment. That protocol is not permission for profiling. That their actions had consequences, not just for their own careers, but for the trust between police and the people they serve. And then came the final moment. Daniel looked at both officers and told them they were to leave the property immediately. Not as a suggestion, as a command. His mother had been harassed, and there was no justification left to hide behind. Greg clenched his jaw, his pride clearly bruised. But he knew better than to argue. James turned first, retreating to the cruiser with quick, quiet steps. Greg followed slower, casting one last glance at Evelyn before sliding into the driver's seat and pulling away down the street. As the patrol car disappeared around the corner, the porch was quiet again. But it wasn't the same quiet as before. Now it was a different kind of stillness. The kind that settles after a truth has been spoken out loud. The kind that makes space for what comes next. Daniel turned to his mother, his voice softer now, asking if she was okay. She nodded. She had been through a lot. But she was still here. Still seated. Still steady. And now, for the first time that day, she didn't feel like she was holding it all alone. By the time the sun had fully dipped behind the rooftops of Rosewood, the quiet little town wasn't so quiet anymore. What happened on Evelyn Brooks' porch wasn't just a personal confrontation, it was a spark, and the town was starting to feel the heat. Word spread quickly, faster than most people expected. A neighbor's phone camera had caught the entire exchange. The officers arriving, Evelyn's calm refusal, Daniel's arrival, and the moment everything changed. The video, grainy but clear, made its way from group chats to social media feeds before the evening was over. People watched it and watched it again. They paused when Greg Dalton's hand moved near his holster. They rewound to hear Evelyn's steady voice as she explained she had done nothing but sit on her own porch. And when Daniel stepped out of the black SUV and introduced himself, there was a collective intake of breath. The whole thing felt like something from a movie. But it wasn't a movie. It was a real moment in a real place that people in Rosewood suddenly couldn't stop talking about. Calls started flooding into the sheriff's department before the night was through. Questions were asked, by residents, by reporters, by state officials who had caught wind of the story. Within 24 hours, the sheriff had suspended both deputies pending investigation. That announcement only stirred more conversation. Some folks were outraged that it had happened at all. Others quietly confessed they weren't surprised. For them, Evelyn's story felt all too familiar. And then there was the town hall meeting. It was held 2 evenings later, in the community center down the street from Evelyn's home. The room was packed, old folding chairs lined up in neat rows, people standing along the walls, some even leaning in from the hallway. It wasn't the usual crowd that showed up for zoning discussions or school board updates. This was different. There was a weight in the air, a nervous kind of energy. Some came out of solidarity, others out of guilt, and a few just wanted to understand what had happened to the town they thought they knew. Evelyn didn't want to go. Not because she was afraid, but because she was tired. Her son gently convinced her, not for her, but for the people who needed to see her. For the girls in the back row who'd only known their grandmothers through second-hand stories. For the neighbors who'd never seen quiet courage up close. So she came, dressed simply, walking slowly with her cane, and took a seat next to Daniel in the front row. The sheriff stepped up to the microphone, his voice lower than usual, his eyes scanning the crowd. He spoke of the incident. He called it a mistake, a failure of judgment. He promised a full review, training reforms, a partnership with a community oversight committee. Some in the audience nodded. Some didn't move at all. Everyone listened. But what no one expected was what happened next. Rebecca Whitman, the neighbor who had made the original 911 call, stood from her seat near the back. She looked different, smaller, somehow. Her voice shook as she introduced herself and admitted what she had done. She said she had been afraid, had made assumptions, hadn't really seen Evelyn at all. Her words were broken, unsure, but real. She apologized, not just to Evelyn, but to the room, to the community. And Evelyn listened. She didn't rush to speak. She didn't soften the moment. When she finally stood, she looked Rebecca in the eyes and spoke slowly, clearly. She accepted the apology, but reminded her, and everyone else, that fear is not a justification. That comfort is not the same as courage. That community requires more than proximity. It requires presence, participation, and understanding. The room didn't erupt. There was no standing ovation. Just a long, quiet silence. The kind that comes when something sinks in deep. After the meeting, people approached Evelyn quietly. Some offered hugs. Some just nodded. A few said thank you. One elderly man whispered that he'd been waiting for someone to say those things for years. Evelyn didn't try to be anything more than what she was, a woman who had lived long enough to know when something needed to be said. Back on Maple Avenue, the porch lights glowed a little brighter that night. People walked their dogs slower. More waved than usual. Evelyn noticed. She didn't need the attention. She didn't want the spotlight. But she did appreciate the shift, however small. Because sometimes, even in a town where change feels like it comes with the seasons, a single moment, when held with truth, can move the ground beneath your feet. The story of what happened on Evelyn Brooks' porch didn't end on Maple Avenue. It didn't fade when the cruiser pulled away or after the town hall meeting quieted down. In fact, that's where it truly began to take root, stretching far beyond a single front yard and into the systems and stories that had been quietly building pressure for years. What started as one moment of injustice turned into a mirror, forcing the entire town to take a hard look at itself. The sheriff's office kept its word, at least on paper. The investigation into the two deputies officially launched. Their body cam footage was pulled and reviewed, not just from that afternoon, but from prior incidents too. And what came to light wasn't just a one-time misstep. Patterns emerged. Repeated stops in predominantly black neighborhoods. Vague justifications for detentions. Community complaints that had quietly gone unresolved or had been dismissed altogether. It became clear that what happened to Evelyn wasn't isolated. It was part of something much bigger, a culture of looking away, of quietly excusing the inexcusable. And once that curtain was pulled back, it was hard to unsee what had always been there. Daniel Brooks knew this. He had hoped that what happened to his mother would be enough to start something real. Not headlines, not trending hashtags, but change. The kind you feel in policy, in training rooms, in the way officers carry themselves when they step onto someone's property. And he didn't stop at pushing the investigation forward. He spoke at city council meetings, worked with local organizers, met with the oversight committee that was quickly formed after the town hall. He didn't come with blame. He came with clarity, with solutions, with the kind of conviction that people listen to when they're finally ready to hear. Meanwhile, the town began to shift. Quietly at first. People who had never spoken out before started to share their stories. At a community forum held inside the neighborhood church, one after another, residents stood up. An older gentleman shared how he had been stopped 5 times walking home from his job at the grocery store, always asked where he was going. A mother described how her teenage son had been frisked for wearing a hoodie near the high school. An elderly woman, nearly Evelyn's age, told the room that she kept her ID on a lanyard around her neck when walking to the corner store, just in case someone thought she didn't belong. These stories weren't dramatic. They weren't loud. But they carried weight. They had been stored in silence for too long. And now, with the door cracked open, they were finally stepping into the light. Evelyn stayed home that night. She folded laundry slowly while Daniel sat in the back of the church, listening to every word. When he returned, she asked how it went, not out of curiosity but out of care. He said it had been hard, but it had also been necessary. She nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. For her, the experience was still settling in. She hadn't wanted to become a symbol. She didn't like the way her face had shown up in headlines or on flyers about town meetings. But she understood the need for it. If her stillness could give others courage, then so be it. She'd lived long enough to know that sometimes you don't choose the role you play, you just show up as yourself, and the world decides it's time to listen. A few days later, the sheriff's department released another public statement. It confirmed the investigation's findings: repeated misconduct, disproportionate stops, failures in proper protocol. The officers remained suspended, and new training measures were introduced, including an independent review board that would work alongside the department moving forward. It wasn't everything, but it was something. A beginning. A signal that what happened on that porch wasn't just going to be brushed aside and forgotten. For Evelyn, the most important change wasn't in the headlines. It was in the way neighbors looked at her differently now. Some with newfound respect, some with awkward smiles, some still unsure of what to say. But the difference was this: they saw her. Not just as an old woman on a porch, but as someone who had always belonged there. Someone who had lived through more than most would ever know, and who had, with grace and quiet strength, reminded them all what dignity really looks like. And for Daniel, the journey was far from over. But as he sat next to his mother one evening, watching the light settle through the trees, he knew they had pushed the line forward. Not all the way. Not yet. But far enough for others to step through behind them. 2 weeks had passed since the day Evelyn Brooks sat quietly on her porch and changed the rhythm of an entire town. Life in Rosewood began to return to what some people called normal. Kids rode their bikes down Maple Avenue again, neighbors trimmed hedges and exchanged small talk, and the mail arrived right on time. But for those who had been paying attention, things weren't quite the same. Not entirely. The silence in town had changed. It had a different texture now. Not empty, but aware. Not polite, but watchful. For Evelyn, the days moved slowly, like always. She still rose early. Still brewed her tea just the way she liked it. Still folded laundry while the radio hummed low in the background. But something inside her had shifted. Not in a dramatic way, not in anger or bitterness. Just deeper, more settled. She had been seen. Not just as a woman sitting alone on a porch, but as someone whose presence carried weight, whose stillness had meaning. And though the headlines were already fading, and the reporters had stopped calling, Evelyn knew her story hadn't ended. It had just passed into something larger. Daniel came by often, sometimes just to sit beside her in the evenings. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they just listened, to the wind in the trees, to the rustle of rose bushes, to the distant sound of kids playing. One night, he told her the sheriff's office had finalized the new training policies. That both officers were still on suspension, with disciplinary review ongoing. He said the state had started looking at similar patterns in nearby departments. And then he said something he hadn't before, that he had been offered a promotion. Chief of Operations. A big title. A bigger responsibility. He didn't bring it up to impress her. He brought it up because he wasn't sure. He wasn't sure if staying in the system meant helping to change it or just helping it stay the same. And Evelyn, as always, listened. She didn't give him an answer. She gave him a pause. A silence that told him he already knew what to do. She understood that kind of silence better than most. After all, it was silence that had defined her stand. She hadn't fought with fists. She hadn't shouted or demanded. She had simply refused to move. She had chosen not to shrink, not to disappear, not to let fear reshape her routine. And somehow, that stillness, so simple, so quiet, had caused a tremor that reached far beyond her porch steps. She never wanted to be a symbol. But she knew symbols mattered. Not because they were perfect, but because they reminded people what was possible. And her porch, once just a place to sip tea and watch the light shift through the trees, had become something else entirely. A line in the sand. A moment of truth. A quiet place where dignity sat tall and didn't flinch. People still walked slower when passing her house now. Some waved. Some didn't. A few left notes, small gifts, flowers, drawings from children, handwritten messages folded with care. Evelyn appreciated them, though she didn't need them. She didn't need confirmation that what she did was right. She knew that in her bones. Because it wasn't about being right. It was about being rooted. That's the part people sometimes forget. That resistance isn't always loud. That courage doesn't always show up in marches or speeches. Sometimes, it's a rocking chair that doesn't budge. A woman who doesn't rise. A voice that speaks low and firm and steady, even when the world leans in, trying to push her down. Evelyn's legacy wasn't in the policy changes or the town meetings. It wasn't even in the viral video. Her legacy was quieter, more lasting. It was in the way people began to look twice before judging. In the way neighbors leaned into discomfort instead of away from it. In the way young girls, watching from the back of the town hall, stood a little taller afterward. And most of all, in the way her son carried himself. Not just as an officer, but as a man shaped by the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. On a warm evening, as crickets sang in the distance and the porch light cast a soft glow over the steps, Evelyn sat in her usual spot. The same chair. The same cushion. The same quiet presence. Daniel sat beside her, both of them watching the sky dim to a deep blue. There was no ceremony, no announcement, no applause. Just the soft weight of knowing something had changed, and knowing that it mattered. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in this world is stay exactly where you are, when everything around you is trying to move you. Evelyn Brooks stayed. And in doing so, she gave others the courage to stand. The story of Evelyn Brooks reminds us that strength doesn't always come from standing up. It often comes from not moving at all. In a world that can be quick to judge and even quicker to dismiss, her quiet defiance became a powerful act of dignity. She didn't shout or resist with force. She simply stayed rooted in who she was, where she belonged, and what she knew to be right. For older audiences especially, there's a deep lesson here. You don't have to match the world's volume to make your presence felt. Sometimes, presence is the message. Evelyn's stillness held more weight than any argument, because it was built on decades of resilience, patience, and self-respect. It teaches us that no matter how invisible the world tries to make us feel with age, our lives, our voices, and our experiences still carry tremendous value. We are not here to shrink. We are here to be seen. And when we hold our ground, not with aggression, but with grace, we remind others what true courage looks like. If this message touched your heart, let us know in the comments what kind of stories or topics you'd like to see next. We love hearing your thoughts and your wisdom. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more real, meaningful stories that inspire and uplift. She was just sitting on her porch, minding her own business. And within minutes, 2 officers tried to arrest her. What happened next? It didn't just change her life. It exposed the truth about how our world sees people like us. You need to see how it ends. Stay with us, like this video, and subscribe right now, because this is a story you'll never forget. It was the kind of afternoon that moved slowly, the way time only seems to in quiet towns. The sun was easing its way down behind the tall trees, casting golden light across the sidewalks of Rosewood, Georgia. A breeze rustled the last of summer's leaves, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and blooming roses. On the edge of Maple Avenue, nestled between newer homes with fresh coats of paint and modern porches, sat a weathered two-story house with a wide front porch and peeling white shutters. It wasn't much to look at for most passers-by, but for Evelyn Brooks, that house was the heart of her world. At 76, Evelyn had lived more lives on that porch than some folks could imagine. She'd rocked babies to sleep there, watched neighbors grow old, tended roses in every season, and sat still through storms, both in the skies and in her life. That porch was where she grieved her husband, fought off the worst days of her cancer, and celebrated the best days of raising her children. Every creak of the wooden boards held a memory. It was hers, every inch of it. That afternoon, Evelyn was doing what she always did when the weather was warm and the light soft. Sitting quietly with a cup of tea, her feet tucked into slippers that had long since molded to her shape. The house behind her might have shown signs of age, but Evelyn was polished in her own way. Silver hair pinned back neatly, lavender dress falling gently around her knees, and a soft calmness in her eyes that only comes with years of living through the hard and the beautiful. To her, it was just another day. But to someone else, apparently, it looked like something else entirely. Across the street, Rebecca Whitman, a younger woman new to the neighborhood, walked her miniature golden doodle past the house like she had many times before. She never waved. She never spoke. She just looked, at the porch, at Evelyn, at the home she didn't understand. That day, though, something changed. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was bias. Maybe it was just the weight of everything people carry when they don't know what to do with their discomfort. But instead of moving on, Rebecca pulled out her phone. She hesitated, then dialed. Inside a small room somewhere in the county dispatch center, a 911 call was logged. The report was vague, an elderly woman acting suspiciously, possibly peering into windows. The words came quickly, stacked with uncertainty and cloaked in concern, but underneath it all was something Evelyn had known all her life. To some people, her stillness wasn't peaceful, it was threatening. And her presence in her own neighborhood wasn't familiar, it was suspicious. Evelyn, of course, knew none of this as she sipped her tea and watched the shadows shift on her rose bushes. She didn't know officers had been dispatched. She didn't know her quiet had been misread as danger. She didn't know the next few minutes would become something far bigger than a mistaken call or an overreaction. She didn't know that her porch, her quiet, simple porch, was about to become the center of a confrontation that would shake not just her but an entire town. She just rocked gently, unaware that peace, for some, is not always protected. And that sometimes, sitting still is all it takes to be seen as a threat.